Hey there, welcome to First Look. Thank you for being here this week, home edition. So I'm glad to have you again for week 3 of our Esther journey. So since this is kind of the pivot point week in this series, I think it's a 5-week series, so this is 3 of 5. I thought that I would kind of pause for a second to kind of reflect a little bit on where we are. So if you've been able to hear or watch or be present for the first 2 sermons, what you'll realize is that I'm trying to kind of take this series from kind of several viewpoints, but kind of with the same concept in mind. So I'm trying to kind of get at how each one of these people in this story, and this is one of those stories that is has a lot of different people who take on different roles. So it's not just about Esther or Esther's relationship with God or Esther's relationship with really any one person. She's really kind of a fulcrum for a lot of different people participating in the story. So the first week was about really focused on Vashti, who was the queen before her, and then this was mostly about Esther, because it's the famous passage that second week yesterday was. But it also had to do with a little bit of Mordecai, a little bit of Hathach, who is the eunuch, who is the kind of the go-between. And this week you're going to see featured a little bit more. We haven't really met the villain in this whole book yet, and so we're gonna be introduced to him a little bit more prominently. So Haman, who, if you know anything about Jewish traditions or holidays, if you're familiar with the holiday of Purim or Purim, I can never say it right. I always think it's Purim, but it's actually, they say Purim. The holiday is really centers on this story, right? So it's kind of made the story into almost a play, and they retell the story, and so it's sort of a cautionary tale, but a heroic tale, and there's kind of something that kind of feels like a festival that goes along with it, with like special food and dress up and all sorts of things. Sometimes there's costumes, and I've never been to a celebration, but I've heard a lot about it, and kind of gotten an idea of what it is. It's kind of they've sort of turned this story, which could have been obviously tragic, into sort of a heroic tale where the people represent either the best in us or the worst in us, and how good triumphs over evil. It kind of becomes that kind of a story in the religious tradition. So one of our parishioners has been good enough that whenever I say Haman, he hisses like this. It's it's Bob, who's on the side. Well, anyway, that's what happens in the story. Whenever they tell the story, there's cheering and booing, whatever, and so you're supposed to boo and hiss whenever Haman's name is mentioned. So anyway, we're going to be introduced a lot to him this week, and the character of that person, and because this is kind of the pivot point. It's like right before his downfall, but it's how all that comes together, and you get to see a lot of the character of this person in this story. And it's all the backdrop of it from a religious standpoint. The theological kind of theme running throughout this particular story, this is chapter 6, is providence. So the idea of God's guidance and plan unfolding, and that we are those who kind of live out a plan or the guidance of the Spirit, those kinds of ideas. That's what providence is. And which is meant to feel like a very comforting thing. And it shows how God's hand is in this story. Again, even though God is not specifically mentioned, and God is not mentioned anywhere in the book, famously. So the story, what you're going to see here, we've gone from the ego of the king Xerxes to which ended up with Vashti being excommunicated, the new rise of the new queen, Haman who's like a official, a diplomat, wants to be adored and is not by this man named Mordecai, who is the cousin of Esther, and puts together a plan to have all of the Jews just erased because Persia they're in exile and Persia has taken them over. So all of this is sort of at their doorstep, and Mordecai asks Esther to intervene in this, and she's in the middle of intervening. And in the middle of that intervention, where Esther will stop this plot, we get to see kind of the character of Haman and the character of Mordecai and a little bit of Xerxes. You get to actually see a lot of these three men, who they really are, what they really care about. But you see a lot of Haman. And I think one of the things I'm really fascinated by is what role he plays in all of this, in this story. Because he is a really proper villain. He's barely someone that you can really even have any kind of sympathy for. It's barely, I guess if you had sympathy for anyone who exhibited a kind of narcissistic behavior, just power hungry, if there's any kind of sympathy you have for that character, maybe you could summon it here, but it's a tough sell because he plays the villain role very well in a way that I think is timeless, and when you see it in real life, the sort of narcissism that you can see from the powerful, when you're kind of looking around it almost becomes comical how explicitly people can kind of play out that character. The fragileness of their egos, the need for compliments, the need for praise, the kind of the anger that can shift so quickly, being, and everything is good, everything is terrible. It's that kind of up and down fragility and just complete self-centeredness that when you see it, you're just kind of blown away by it. Because 95% of the people that we're not all perfect, but we exhibit some level of empathy and care for other people. And Haman just doesn't have any of that. And so you're going to see that here in chapter 6. So that's kind of where we are in terms of what this piece of the story looks like. So let me read it to you. And I'm to the point now I'm going to have to read it with some assistance. So here we go. All right. So this covers the fact that this sort of covers the dynamic between Mordecai, Xerxes the king, and Haman all at the same time. So this is chapter 6. That night the king could not sleep, So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. That fact is kind of, it's in the book, but it's kind of buried in there because we're covering other things. So what honor and recognition had Mordecai received for this, the king asked. Nothing had been done for him, his attendants answered, which makes sense if you think about the fact that this is an Israelite. He was, someone who was under the ordinance of the king. This vast kingdom, he would have gotten lost in the shuffle very easily. So the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on a pole that he had set up for him. Mordecai was plotting to figure out how he could get rid of Mordecai in a couple of different ways, and his spouse says, well, why don't you just put him up basically on a pike? And the guy's like, that's a good idea, I should go tell the king that. And so he's coming in to make this suggestion. So Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king says. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, well, who is there for the king that they would rather honor than me? Just thought he was talking about him. So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden on, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Well, go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything that you have recommended. Now, pause for a second. Realize that Mordecai and the Jews and Haman are all at the center of our story, right? We all recognize that. For Xerxes, who is the king of all Persia, he can't keep track of any of that. Like the fact that the Jewish people are about to be annihilated just wasn't even really on his radar. This wasn't like a big story in his day. I mean, which is how all this kind of comes. It's not like he thought through, well, should we annihilate these people? I don't know. It's so vast and it's so many people and it's so big, and he's also a little out to lunch because he's worried about his own power and ego and partying and all that kind of stuff, that he doesn't even really put two and two together. Like the fact that he didn't know who stopped this plot to kill him tells you something about kind of where his head is. So when he comes before Haman to say hey, we should really honor this guy Mordecai, it's not like bells were going off in Xerxes' head like they would have been for Mordecai's. He's just saying, oh, this guy did this thing, we should honor him. He doesn't know who he's talking about. He just knows his name is Mordecai. So go at once, the king commanded Haman, get the robe and the horse and do just as you had suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. He even calls him that and he still doesn't put it together. Do not neglect anything that you have recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse, and he robed Mordecai and led him on the horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Now, it's going to talk about this in a second, but think for a minute about what's going on. Mordecai is being lifted up for stopping this plot. And he's already kind of conspired with Esther to figure out how to stop this this annihilation of the people. And while all that's happening, Haman is so infuriated that he sets up a plan just to kill Mordecai, because he won't kneel before him. Like, he's just furious about this. And so now he has to, he has egg on his face. He has to like parade this guy around who he hates because the king said he had to. What else was he going to do? So that's where we are. So afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home, and his head covered in grief, and told Zeresh, his wife, and all of his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." Well, now, part of what to know about that is that this is kind of a throwback to the fact that, and I mentioned this in the sermon yesterday, that Haman is an Amalekite by ancestry. And the Amalekites were ancient enemies of Israel and were often on the losing end. So they kind of historically, through religious history or otherwise, would have understood kind of what they were up against here. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Now, we don't know, if you're just reading chapter 6, you don't know what that is, but Esther, whenever she gets together the wherewithal to stop what's about to happen with her people, she goes before Xerxes and says, she's like, she comes to the court and she gets received well. Like, she was all nervous because if she wasn't received by the king, she could be put to death. So he's in a good mood. He's like, "Oh yes, my queen, come in." Accepts her and says, "Anything you want, half my kingdom, whatever you want is yours." He's in a wonderful mood and he's glad to see Esther. And Esther says, "All I'd like you to do is come to a banquet. I'm preparing a banquet, and it's for you. And if you could invite Haman, that would be wonderful." So before this, chapter 5, Haman's all happy because he's been invited to go to this banquet. And he's the only person besides the king who was invited by name. And so he's all happy about this. And then, he sees Mordecai, and Mordecai doesn't battle him. And then he gets all mad again. And he goes to his wife, who was mentioned before. And he's like, "What do I do? I'm going to be honored, but this guy keeps being kind of a thorn in my side." And she goes, "Oh, you should put him on a pike." That's where we are in the story. So now the banquet, which Esther is throwing basically to point the finger at what's about to, what's happening, she is preparing. So that's where we are in the story. So, a couple of things for you to think about. First, do you remember in chapter 4, which is what we used for this past sermon yesterday, that in the story, Mordecai is talking to Esther through the servant, through the eunuch, and says, "Look, you need to tell her, you need to do this. Perhaps you are queen just for this reason. But listen, if you don't do this, don't think that you're going to be safe. One, that it will be your downfall. And two, God's going to find a way anyway. You need to do this, and this needs to be the way that you live out your calling. But if you don't live out your calling, that is not going to stop God." So that's kind of where that was the sticking point for Esther. You need to be a part of this. So you can kind of see how what Mordecai was saying about about where, how they would be delivered. Deliverance will come, whether it's from you or from some other place. You can see that start to come to fruition right there in front of you as the king recognizes Mordecai and lifts him up. And that would have been, Mordecai's window to say, listen, you have honored me. The only thing I want for this honor is for you to not annihilate my people. So you can see how there was some providential kind of care being done along the way for Mordecai and the people. So Haman, again, becomes this kind of caricature of someone who has all of these narcissistic stereotypes. It's all of these ego-driven kind of things. And it's interesting to watch him and Xerxes kind of duke it out to see who exhibits it the most. Xerxes at least has a sense of wanting to please other people, and Haman doesn't seem to have any of that. So some of what I can see me talking about is just, the dangers of that kind of plight, and how I'm sure Haman probably had people in his corner, who wanted to lift him up, and you can almost see the social media presence he would have, that he would be able to kind of get a following and, get people who would support him, who would ignore his, egocentric kind of belligerence, and would almost admire him, because some people just wish that they were like that too. This is true. So that's kind of gives you a broad spectrum of where the story is headed. So I had a thought that I thought I'd end with here, just as I was kind of looking at this story. Just to kind of step back from the plot for a minute, and just kind of look at the book from the side. Esther is one of those stories that there is, I think, someone much smarter than me who was talking to you about religious history and kind of archaeological evidence or biblical evidence of things, looking at it from an objective viewpoint in terms of, did Esther literally historically exist? Was there a king named Xerxes? Yes. Did this story actually literally happen? I think it would be one of those stories that would come into question, right, from a literal standpoint. Kind of in the ways that some of the story of like Jonah could come into question. Not that this story couldn't have happened. I mean, there's nothing supernatural in the story at all. Nothing from that standpoint. Jonah being swallowed by a whale and then coughed up on that's stretches the imagination of what is possible biologically and physically and literally more than this story. Certainly this story could have historically happened from the way we understand how science and humanity and people work. But I think that many people would tell you, who are experts in scripture and biblical history and Middle Eastern history, etc., that there is at least a possibility that it did not literally happen. And one, I guess I wanted to ask, does that bother you? And two, I think when we come up against stories like that, so whether we're supposed to take something literally in the Bible or not, there are things that we do with that I think, I hope are helpful. And so let me explain what I mean. I think that we all have to make a choice in terms of the way we understand faith as an explanation of what we understand to be true around us, right? So you either believe that God exists or you don't. You either believe that a literal deity exists, or you believe that the universe and the world around us, is like the way we talk about God is some kind of manifestation of what we actually see around us. It's kind of a guide, right? Something that moves history and our lives in it, day by day. You either think of that as literally true, or you don't, or you think of it somewhere kind of in between. There's lots of ways that people think about their own faith and God, right? I'm just telling you things that are true. I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm telling you, here's how things are presented. Now, if you take for a moment the assumption that God is literally true, and that when we pray, we are praying to one who hears us, and you can get your head around the fact that a man named Jesus the Christ, who is God's Son, who is a member of the Trinity, was a part of this world, then you can probably get your head around the fact that maybe this story existed. But if those things are true, then my question is, does the story of Esther being literally true, or is it, if it's a story like a parable that was given to us for our teaching by God, but a parable given to us by God for our teaching, for our learning? Is there a difference to you in how you experience the story? And I'm not telling you that you should or shouldn't, either way, but I am saying that's something that people would consider when it comes to this specific story. In the same way that they might a psalm, in the same way that they might a parable again of Jesus. When Jesus told a parable, he wasn't saying something like a lie. He was just explaining a truth of God in story form, which is what this is. This is a long form of that. And so I'm just asking, how does that feel for you? Makes a big difference? Makes no difference? Something I thought I would give you now that we're about halfway through this series. I thought I would mention it. Okay. So ultimately, I think when I hope that you get away from this series, not only do I hope that you're more you understand the story better, but also that there's a lot of different ways of kind of looking at the viewpoint of the story changes constantly from chapter to chapter. And we can get a lot from each individual journey, but also how those journeys overlap. And we can kind of see God at work, even if God isn't directly mentioned, which is a fascinating way of kind of studying Scripture. Okay. Well, that's what I have for you this week. Went a couple of minutes over that I usually do, but thank you for letting me kind of think through all of that and try to explain where we are. I hope that you gain something significant, or maybe even just insignificant, from this story and from this series. I've been enjoying doing it, but we'll see where it kind of takes us. Well, have a wonderful week. Thank you for being you, and I will see you next time for another First Look. Take care.